When Columbus landed in the Caribbean in 1492, he thought he'd found Asia. He hadn't. He'd found a continent that had already been home to somewhere between 50 and 100 million people for at least 15,000 years, with cities, empires, trade networks stretching thousands of miles, and one city near what is now St. Louis that was, at its peak, larger than London. Columbus didn't discover America, he interrupted it. And then, within 150 years of his arrival, up to 90% of the people already living here were dead. This is the story of what was here before America existed, and how a country that didn't exist 250 years ago somehow ended up running the world. Let's go back to the very beginning, about 15,000 years ago, when a group of people crossed a land bridge connecting what's now Siberia to Alaska during the last ice age. They probably didn't know they were discovering a new continent. They were most likely just following animals. But their descendants spread across two entire continents over thousands of years, reaching the southern tip of South America before most of Europe had figured out iron. By the year 1000 AD, almost 500 years before Columbus, the Americas were home to some of the most impressive civilizations on Earth. In Mexico, the ancestors of the Aztecs were building cities with populations larger than anything in Europe. By the time the Spanish arrived, their capital, Tenochtitlan, had roughly 200,000 people, aqueducts, floating gardens, and a market so organized that the Spanish soldiers who first saw it said they thought they were dreaming. In South America, the Inca Empire controlled a territory stretching 4,000 miles along the Andes, connected by 25,000 miles of road, all built without a single wheel or horse, which, frankly, makes the fact that we complained about building the interstate highway system slightly embarrassing. And in what would eventually become the United States, specifically near the confluence of the Mississippi, Missouri, and Illinois rivers, where the city of St. Louis now sits, there was a city called Cahokia. At its peak, around 1100 AD, Cahokia had a population of up to 20,000 people, more than 120 earthen mounds, and trade connections reaching from the Great Lakes to the Gulf Coast. Its largest mound covered more ground at its base than the Great Pyramid of Giza. It was the largest urban center north of Mexico, and it was bigger than London at the same time. Almost nobody today knows it existed. It is not in most American history textbooks. The land where it once stood is now largely a state park, a quiet, grassy expanse of mounds that most Americans drive past without knowing what they're looking at. In 1492, Columbus set sail from Spain, convinced he could reach Asia by heading west. He found the Caribbean islands instead, brought back some gold, a handful of captives, and told the Spanish crown that there was more where that came from. The Spanish king and queen were delighted. They told Columbus to go back, convert everyone to Christianity, and bring more gold. Columbus, who had described the people he met as generous, gentle, and intelligent in his own journals, went back and did exactly what the crown asked. What Columbus actually set in motion, beyond the gold, beyond the colonies, was the largest demographic catastrophe in recorded human history. The people of the Americas had been isolated from Eurasian diseases for thousands of years. They had no immunity to smallpox, measles, or influenza. When those diseases arrived, they spread faster than any explorer, moving from village to village before Europeans even knew those villages existed. Within 150 years of Columbus's arrival, somewhere between 80 and 90% of the indigenous population of the Americas was dead. Tens of millions of people, entire civilizations, gone. The untouched wilderness that European settlers would later describe wasn't natural, it was emptied. The Great Dying, scholars call it, the single largest mortality event in human history as a share of the global population, bigger than World War II, bigger than the Black Death. Columbus didn't discover America. He ended one version of it and started another. Spain, flush with success, moved fast. Spain and Portugal, the two dominant powers of the age, literally sat down and drew a line down the middle of the map of the world, and agreed that everything on one side was Portugal's and everything on the other was Spain's. The rest of the world was not consulted. Portugal sailed around Africa to build a trading empire in Asia. The Spanish went straight for the parts of the Americas with gold and large populations to put to work, which meant heading south into Mexico and South America, where the Aztec and Inca empires happened to be sitting on centuries of accumulated wealth. North America, no gold, no silver, fewer large population centers, was essentially ignored. Spain sent an expedition there in 1539, found nothing interesting, and left. For nearly a century, the land that would eventually become the most powerful country on Earth was the part of the map that nobody wanted. England had actually sent an explorer to North America years before the Spanish even reached Florida. Then they looked at the map, looked at what Spain was doing in South America, and essentially said, interesting, and went home for 100 years. England's first serious attempt at a colony was at Roanoke, North Carolina, in 1585. Then England got busy fighting a war with Spain, and the colony mysteriously disappeared, completely and without explanation. Every single person was gone. No bodies, no signs of violence, just a single word carved into a tree. Historians have been arguing about what happened to the Roanoke colony for over 400 years. We still don't know. They tried again at Jamestown in 1607. This one survived, though barely. Disease, starvation, and disastrous relations with local indigenous nations nearly wiped it out multiple times in its first decade. Then the Pilgrims arrived in Plymouth in 1620, strict religious separatists who outlawed gambling, banned the celebration of Christmas, and believed that excessive fun was a spiritual failure. They were, somehow, the ones who made it work long term. Before long, the entire East Coast was filling up with British colonies. While Britain was busy building colonies on the coast, France had quietly claimed something much larger, the entire interior of the continent. French explorers had traveled the Mississippi River system and planted flags across a territory they called New France, stretching from Canada all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. By 1754, there was only one way to settle who actually owned what: a war. New France had about 60,000 people. The British colonies had over 1 million. France brought in indigenous alliances to even the odds. Britain did the same. The French and Indian War lasted nearly a decade. Britain won, decisively. When the maps were redrawn, France lost almost everything. Britain now controlled most of eastern North America. This seemed like a great outcome for Britain. It was about to become a very expensive problem. Winning a continent-spanning war costs money. Britain had spent heavily fighting France and now needed to recoup. The obvious solution: tax the colonies. The colonies had other thoughts. They had no representatives in the British Parliament. Taxation without representation, as far as the colonists were concerned, was tyranny, even if the taxes were, by objective measure, quite small compared to what people back in Britain were paying. What started as a disagreement over tax policy escalated into protests, then skirmishes, then a full revolution. On the 4th of July, 1776, the 13 colonies declared their independence from Great Britain. Declaring independence and actually achieving it took 5 more years of war. When it was finally over, the British conceded. The United States of America existed, sort of. The new country had a problem. The 13 colonies had essentially become 13 separate countries that happened to share a flag. The central government had almost no real power. It couldn't collect taxes, couldn't regulate trade, couldn't make anyone do anything. The new nation was failing. Quickly. The Founding Fathers convened, scrapped the existing system entirely, and wrote a new document from scratch, the Constitution, which created a federal government that actually had authority while still leaving significant power with individual states. 9 states ratified it. It became the law of the land. In 1789, George Washington became the first president of the United States, a country that was still only this big, with everything west of the Mississippi belonging to Spain. Napoleon Bonaparte had seized power in France and was busy conquering most of Europe. He also had plans for a French empire in the Americas, starting with the Louisiana Territory, which Spain had quietly handed back to France. America was worried. The Mississippi River was essential for moving goods, and if Napoleon controlled New Orleans at the river's mouth, he controlled American trade. So America asked if it could just buy New Orleans. Napoleon's response surprised everyone. "How about I sell you all of it?" His reasoning was strategic. He needed money for his wars with Britain. A slave rebellion had just destroyed French plans in the Caribbean, and he didn't want America to side with the British. So he sold the entire Louisiana territory, 828,000 square miles, for $15 million. America had asked for one city. It got a continent's worth of land for less than 3 cents an acre. America had just doubled in size. With more land than it knew what to do with, and a population almost doubling every generation, the average American family in this era had 7 children, because there wasn't much else to do. The pressure to move west was constant. Millions of Americans moved into territories that were already home to indigenous nations, the same peoples whose ancestors had built Cahokia, who had been farming, trading, and governing themselves across this continent for thousands of years, before a single European ship ever crossed the Atlantic. What followed was a systematic displacement, forced marches, broken treaties, and a series of wars that pushed indigenous nations further west with each generation, until there was nowhere left to push them. It is one of the most consequential and least honestly told chapters in American history. In 1819, America bought Florida from Spain. 2 years later, Mexico won its independence from Spain, and America had a new southern neighbor. The northern regions of Mexico were sparsely populated and hard to govern. The Mexican government, in a decision it would quickly regret, invited American settlers to populate Texas. Those settlers arrived, multiplied rapidly, and outnumbered the Mexicans within a generation. In 1836, Texas declared independence from Mexico. In 1845, the United States let Texas join the Union. Mexico was, understandably, not thrilled. A border dispute between Texas and Mexico became a full-scale war. When it ended, the United States paid Mexico $15 million, the same amount it had paid Napoleon for Louisiana, and took the northern Mexican territories, which became California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and parts of Wyoming and Colorado. A separate deal bought another strip in the South for $10 million. Meanwhile, Britain and America negotiated a clean split of the Oregon Territory, Britain taking everything above the 49th parallel, America everything below. In the span of about 50 years, through negotiation, purchase, and one war, America had gone from the East Coast to the Pacific Ocean. Then, someone found gold in California, which made all of it feel very worth it. There was one massive, unresolved problem inside all that newly acquired territory, one that the Founding Fathers had seen clearly and deliberately chosen not to resolve: slavery. The men who wrote "All men are created equal" in 1776 had, in the same breath, allowed slavery to continue, partly because they needed Southern states to ratify the Constitution, and partly because they told themselves it would work itself out over time. It did not work itself out over time. Northern states had abolished slavery by the early 1800s. Southern states had built their entire agricultural economy around it, an economy powered by the forced labor of roughly 4 million enslaved people by the time the conflict reached its breaking point. The two sides had been in increasingly uneasy coexistence for decades, held together by a series of political compromises that satisfied nobody but kept the country from splitting apart. That fragile arrangement ended the moment Abraham Lincoln was elected president in 1860. Lincoln wasn't even on the ballot in most Southern states. Southern leaders, convinced his election meant the end of slavery, began seceding before he was even inaugurated. By 1861, 11 states had left the Union and formed the Confederate States of America. What followed was the deadliest conflict in American history. The Civil War lasted 4 years. It killed an estimated 620,000 to 750,000 soldiers, more Americans than died in both world wars combined. Entire towns sent every able-bodied man and lost most of them. Families split along the Mason-Dixon line. Brothers genuinely fought brothers. The country that had been built on the idea of freedom had to tear itself nearly in half to make that idea mean what it said. The Union won. On April 9, 1865, Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered. Slavery was abolished through the 13th Amendment. The country was legally reunited. 5 days after Lee's surrender, Abraham Lincoln was shot at Ford's Theater in Washington and died the following morning. The man most responsible for holding the country together long enough to win didn't live to see what it became. The United States emerged from the Civil War physically exhausted economically devastated in the South, and morally uncertain about what reconciliation actually meant. A question, in many ways, that it is still working through today. Shortly after the Civil War, Russia offered to sell Alaska. America's Secretary of State, William Seward, negotiated a price of $7.2 million, roughly 2 cents per acre. Congress and the American press mocked him relentlessly. Newspapers called it Seward's Folly and Seward's Icebox. Cartoonists drew him paying a fortune for a frozen wasteland full of polar bears. Then they discovered oil and realized its military position was critical during World War II, and that it contained some of the largest untapped natural resources on the continent. Seward had the last laugh. He was just several decades early. Meanwhile, American businessmen had quietly taken effective control of the Hawaiian Islands and asked the United States to annex them. The president at the time refused, saying America had no right to seize a sovereign nation. His successor disagreed. In 1898, an American warship called the USS Maine exploded in Havana Harbor under disputed circumstances. American newspapers ran headlines blaming Spain, public outrage reached a peak, and the United States declared war. The war lasted about 4 months. America won. It took Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines from Spain, effectively ending what remained of the Spanish Empire that Columbus had started building 4 centuries earlier. During the war, America also annexed Hawaii, which was becoming strategically important as a naval base in the Pacific. Theodore Roosevelt became president shortly after, having famously led a cavalry charge in Cuba, despite having no actual cavalry experience. He was that kind of person. Roosevelt had one major strategic problem. America had coastlines on both the Atlantic and Pacific, but no fast way to move its navy between them. Ships had to sail around the entire southern tip of South America, a journey of weeks. The solution was a canal cut through Central America. Colombia, which controlled the territory, initially agreed. Then it changed its mind and asked for more money. Roosevelt's response was to quietly support Panamanian independence from Colombia, which happened within days of the right people being in the right place. The newly independent Panama then signed the canal rights over to the United States. The Panama Canal opened in 1914. Ships could now move between oceans in hours rather than weeks. The United States had the second largest navy in the world, and the infrastructure to use it. World War I had just begun. America was ready, whether it knew it yet or not. 15,000 years of human civilization, cities that rivaled London, empires with roads stretching across mountain ranges without wheels, trade networks connecting a continent. Then disease arrived and took 90% of it within a generation. Then a series of explorers, colonists, revolutionaries, presidents, and quite frankly opportunists spent the next 400 years negotiating, purchasing, fighting over, and slowly filling in a map, each generation inheriting a country larger and more complicated than the one before it. America's rise to the top of the world wasn't inevitable. It was a sequence of accidents, catastrophes, lucky purchases, and decisions made by people who had absolutely no idea what they were actually starting. The country that came out of all of it is one of the strangest things in history. A nation 250 years old, sitting on top of a civilization 15,000 years old, most of which it spent a very long time pretending wasn't there.